This week on Inside Scoop.
We also have a bipartisan consensus that anything goes.
America off the rails.
And the equal time rule at its core is about stopping legacy media from picking winners and losers in elections.
Stephen Colbert and the censorship question.
Not something that was becoming of a member of the royal family.
The Royal Reckoning over the Epstein files. Welcome to Inside Scoop, where we talk about all the news that's fit to print in the Washington Examiner magazine. I'm Jim Antle, your host. And this week, we're talking about the FCC and dated broadcast rules based on a piece written by Jay Caruso. It seems like every time that we're talking about Jimmy Kimmel or Stephen Colbert or any of the other late night hosts, it has something to do with the clash with the Trump administration. Since President Trump has returned to office, the Trump FCC has been a lot tougher in its showdowns with hostile legacy media than ever before.
People have more trust and faith in gas station sushi today than they do in the legacy news media.
But in many cases, what they're relying on are rules about equal time and other broadcasting regulations that really predate the Trump administration by many decades. They go back to when there were just a few television networks, and they really tried to regulate how fair and balanced the media would be. There has been a long-standing belief that the media is biased against Republicans and that this has intensified since Donald Trump has been president. Trump, however, because he has his own television background, clashes with a lot of high-profile comedians and TV commentators in a way that you really wouldn't have seen with other Republican presidents. Stephen Colbert has had an interview that he couldn't air on his late night show that did eventually show up on YouTube. Colbert claims he is being censored by the Trump administration.
FCCU.
His network has said that they did not want to air the interview on the TV show because they feared that it would not necessarily comply with the equal time rules. The equal time rules that are supposed to keep TV networks from sort of putting the finger on the scale for one candidate or another during a competitive campaign cycle. These have been in place for a while, but they haven't always been interpreted as something that applies to late night TV shows. Now, these late night TV shows have frequently been more about comedy and entertainment than politics, but in the last few years, the opposite has been the case. The FCC largely interpreted Jay Leno's promotion of Arnold Schwarzenegger's gubernatorial campaign 20 plus years ago as being within the confines of the equal time rules.
This is probably now the fifth time you've pulled some trick on me, and I've known you for a long time.
And so there are many defenders of Colbert who think that interviewing one but not the other candidate in a competitive Texas Democratic primary for Senate would certainly pass the muster. There are some, however, within his own network, and certainly some adjacent to the Trump FCC, who think otherwise.
This was Democrat on Democrat violence. CBS was very clear that Colbert could run the interview that he wanted with that political candidate. They just said you may have to comply with equal time, which would have meant potentially giving airtime to Jasmine Crockett and another candidate.
But a bigger issue is, do any of these rules really apply to the competitive media environment that exists today? After all, this interview did end up showing, and it's possible that it got more attention for the candidate involved than would have been the case if it had even just aired on the normal TV show.
And because my network clearly doesn't want us to talk about this, let's talk about this.
Now a lot of people are watching the late night shows, if they're watching them at all, through select clips that they see on social media.
The network says I can't give you URL or a QR code, but I promise you, if you go to our YouTube page, you'll find it.
TikTok videos and Reels. So things that might have been censorship in the past, or even had a major political impact in the past, might not apply as much today. Stephen Colbert, who is seeing his show end relatively soon, could, in a completely different platform, reemerge and do many of the same things that he's doing right now. And yet at the same time, Colbert and Kimmel get a lot of attention by claiming they're being censored by the Trump administration.
Let's just call this what it is. Donald Trump's administration wants to silence anyone who says anything bad about Trump on TV because all Trump does is watch TV.
Are they being censored? Or do the old rules not even really apply anymore? What do you think? Comment down below. And this week, I'd like to welcome Isaac Schorr, who wrote the Washington Examiner magazine cover story about government by retribution. Welcome, Isaac.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
So, Isaac, we've been talking for 20 plus years now about political polarization and partisanship and partisan stratification, but there seems to be a tendency right now in both political parties that you get at in your piece that really seems to be intensifying this dynamic like never before. Why don't you walk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I talk about in the piece is kind of this growing concern about the weight of our politics and the sense that every election carries massive and even sometimes people say potentially existential consequences. And what I do is I consider the possibility that, we're right to feel that things are spinning off the rails a little bit. And so what I do is I go back to the Obama administration. You could go back probably to any start point you might like. But I go back to the Obama administration and I look at things like dragging the little sisters of the poor into court, acknowledging that DACA would be unconstitutional and then signing an executive order to that effect anyway. Then there's him pouring fuel on the fire of the Ferguson race riots, even though his own Department of Justice kind of went in and disproved all of the kind of myths that had created kind of a tinderbox, a powder keg there. So what I do is I go back to Obama, I run through those examples. There's any number of examples from Trump 1 of kind of government just by id. There's no sense of restraint. There's nothing holding people back. So I go through Trump 1, obviously the most prominent example from his first administration is kind of his treatment of his electoral loss in 2020.
Right.
And we all know how that went. And then there's President Biden. There's all this concern, all this hoopla about, election integrity. The country is fiercely divided. So what's the first thing he does is he proposes a federal election takeover and casts opponents of it as flavors and segregationists. And then plenty of other examples, but the prosecution of Donald Trump by both his Department of Justice and then also by progressive prosecutors in New York and Georgia are another example. And kind of the impetus for this piece was the events in Minnesota last month, where we saw, on policy grounds, very reasonable for the president to, crack down on immigration. I mean, he had a mandate to do so after his victory in 2024. But how he did it is the problem, right? There's nothing keeping him in between the lines, so to speak.
So there just seems to be a dynamic that we see in both parties and in multiple administrations now of if you can do something, then you should, and there's no sense that simply because you can do something, maybe you should not.
Yeah, I mean, it's the death of prudence, right? You can say we have polarization, but we also have a bipartisan consensus that anything goes. And that's being driven by, a variety of factors. But I think and both sides will blame each other and point at each other. But whatever you think extent to which each side has gone in this direction, I don't think you can deny that both have.
So if there's anything both parties seem to have in common right now, it's the belief that their own leadership is very weak and that the opposing party's leadership is willing really to stop at nothing to accomplish its goals. And Republicans maybe to a little extent solve that with Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump is viewed by a lot of the Republican rank and file as being stronger than past Republican leaders, but there's still not a lot of confidence in the Republican congressional leadership. A lot of Democrats believe that their leadership is not as strong as, say, Mitch McConnell, not as ruthless, and that does seem to drive a certain amount of our politics right now, doesn't it?
It absolutely does, and it's just interesting because you kind of have this gap between that perception and what's actually happening, and this willingness to do more than any leaders have before. I mean, like you said, I think a lot of people will acknowledge that President Trump is willing to flex his muscles a bit, but even President Biden, I think there's a lot of progressives out there who would say that, his administration tanked because he was not running with a banner of, bold colors, that he was running on pale pastels. But,
Right.
he ran as a moderate and he governed much further to the left. I mean, I could list any number of things. But his Department of Justice did prosecute the man he had defeated in the prior election.
Right.
I mean, they went totally laissez-faire on the border. So you're right. It's fascinating, this gap between perception of the electorate, or at least the bases of the electorate, and what's actually happening.
Are there any off-ramps from this political brinksmanship, or is this pretty much the new way of doing politics now?
I mean, I would like to think there's got to be an off-ramp somewhere. I mean, I don't have any, perfect solutions, but I mean, I think that the primary system is maybe one of the major drivers of it.
Mm-hmm.
And what we have are, you know, only so many people vote in the Republican and Democratic primary. I think there's probably a large mass of America that would like to see us take off ramps, but they're not actually participating. So, in some sense, there's some participation that is driving this extremism, but then there's also non-participation that's, preventing us from seeking a way out. And then, of course, I think there's the media. I think that on the left, there's a mainstream media that's really coddled them in a lot of ways. And there's a lot of myths about, the government, what the Democrats do, what the Republicans do, what Republicans believe. There's a lot of coddling of, I think, the Democratic base by the mainstream media. And then on the right, I think it's great. There's this new right-wing media that, provides a service that previously didn't exist. But we're also seeing a lot of bad actors spring up there too.
Thank you, Isaac. If you're watching us on YouTube, you could read Isaac's full story by clicking here on our digital magazine. The Epstein files are sparking a royal reckoning. Our Madeline Coyne shares how it's affecting the UK and what it could mean for the US.
The second son of Queen Elizabeth II, Andrew, had close ties with Jeffrey Epstein for decades. In 2015, a lawsuit was filed alleging Epstein trafficked a 17-year-old Virginia Giuffre for Andrew. Public pressure intensified in November 2019 after Andrew's BBC interview, where he defended his contact with Epstein after his 2008 conviction.
That he has quite obviously conducted himself in a manner unbecoming, yes.
Unbecoming? He was a sex offender?
Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm being polite.
Days later, Andrew announced he was stepping back from royal duties. On October 30th, Buckingham Palace announced that King Charles III initiated the process to remove Andrew's style, titles, and honors. Thames Valley Police arrested Andrew in February on suspicion of misconduct in public office. The arrest stemmed from allegations that, while serving as the United Kingdom's special representative for international trade, he shared confidential government information with Epstein. Andrew denied any wrongdoing in relation to these matters. He was released without charge after questioning, but the investigation continues. The scandal's reach extends beyond the palace, but continues to be parallel. On February 23rd, Metropolitan Police arrested Peter Mandelson, UK ambassador to the United States, on suspicion of misconduct in public office, the same offense under investigation in the case against Andrew. The optics of a former ambassador under criminal suspicion and a royal stripped of status creates an awkward backdrop for diplomatic engagements. The swift removal of Mandelson highlights vetting lapses at the highest levels of British government. The arrest have fueled domestic calls for accountability in London without triggering a fallout in Washington.
I think it's a shame. I think it's very sad. I think it's so bad for the royal family.
U.S. officials have offered little to no public comment on the British cases, maintaining a focus on bilateral cooperation in defense, trade, and intelligence. But the U.S.-UK alliance proceeds on autopilot with joint exercises, trade talks, and summits. While the alliance between these two countries remains largely untouched by the Epstein Royal Reckoning, it serves as a reminder to both sides of the Atlantic that the past, once buried, has a way of resurfacing at the worst time.
Thank you, Madeline. You can read that story and all the articles that we've talked about in today's show in the Washington Examiner magazine. This has been your Inside Scoop. I'm Jim Antle, your host. We'll catch you next time.